Yeah. I'm pretty sure Morris doesn't have school today. I think we should have been at least 2 hours.
All right, chapter 22 is about the origin of species. So we're going to talk about what a species is, and we'll talk a little bit about how species interbreed and some of the barriers that prevent them from interbreeding. So it's game plan today. Remember Darwin in the Galapagos finches? When he was on the Galapagos Islands, he noticed a lot of different species of plants and animals that he had never seen anywhere else in the world. So he thought he was visiting a place of Genesis. So a quote taken from his book: "Both in space and time, we seem to be brought somewhere near to the great fact, the mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth." Remember, at the time, evolution was the mystery of mysteries. Where did life come from? How did species evolve? So what is a species? When we look at the term species, it's the Latin meaning for kind or appearance. But the more technical term is that there's differences in morphology, just like structures, body functions, biochemistry, as well as behavior and genetic makeup. Here I have an eastern meadowlark and a western meadowlark. They have similar body structures, very similar colorations, as you can see here. This one's got a little bit more prominent yellow here compared to this one. But they do represent different species. Their songs are very distinct. So they have different songs, they have different behaviors, and because of these differences, it helps prevent interbreeding between these two species.
No. That one's a peak on the right. Looks a little thicker, but that's fine.
Okay. Take a look at these two diagrams. Tell me if you think they are the same species or not.
Absolutely not.
One's a little furrier than the other one.
Nope, they're the same, Zach. They are the same species.
No.
I still don't think
Just
so.
call out Zach.
Yeah.
Zach, looking at you, Zach.
It's a little browner on the
No, Herman just put in there.
Yeah, they just said yeah.
What? You guys don't get to talk.
Actually,
Mute
these
yourself.
are the same species. Okay, how about these pictures right here? Same species?
Yeah, you know it. Same species. Absolutely.
They can't.
Looking at you, Zach.
One of them's a female, one of them's a male.
Yes, they are the same species. One of them is a female, one of them is a male. But they are the same species.
Of course, the female is bigger than some
Okay.
animals. I don't know why that is.
So the objectives today, we'll talk about the differences between sympatric and allopatric speciation, which you have no idea what that means yet, but don't worry, we'll get there. Instantaneous speciation and polyploidy will probably be tomorrow's topic. We'll talk about hybrid of species. We'll talk about pre-zygotic and post-zygotic isolation mechanisms. And yeah, you guys can read the rest. So let's just get started here. The nature of species. In order for the species of concepts to occur, you have to have two phenomena. One, a distinctiveness of species that occur together at the same location, but there has to be a connection that exists among the different populations belonging to the same species. So how can we account for both of these? So we're going to talk about sympatric species first. Sympatric species inhabit the same locations, but they are very distinct. These are species, they occur together, that's why they're called sympatric, but they have distinctive entities, which means that they're different, either phenotypically, or maybe they utilize different parts of a habitat, maybe they have a different food source, or maybe they have different behaviors. So you can think of like a bird feeder. If you set out a bird feeder and watched it and recorded your observations every day, you would notice different species, but they all occur in the same location, so we can call them sympatric species.
So that could be like a big difference. So like from like wolves to birds would be sympatric.
If they all went to the same bird feeder.
Oh. So like squirrels and birds maybe would even
Sure.
be the same? Oh, okay.
But occasionally, two species that are in the same location appear to be very, very identical to each other. So in order to tell if they're the same species or not, we kind of have to go beyond the visual similarities, like the different mating calls in birds, or maybe the secretion of certain chemicals. We as humans might have trouble distinguishing if they're the same species or not, but they don't. They know who they are, and they know what other species are. So, yeah. We do know that sometimes in a population of species, they have the same kind of geographic variations. We call these like subspecies. So within a single species, we have individuals that occur in different areas, but they are yet distinct from one another. I know that sounds really, really confusing, but basically they look very, very similar, but because they're in different areas, they are still distinct from one another.
So like people would be a different subspecies, and then like American and Chinese.
Sure. Yeah, there we go. Actually, the term subspecies, they used to use the term race, but they don't use that anymore. So it's subspecies now. Yeah. So some questions. What factors divide this biological diversity in separate forms that we identify as species? What accounts for both that distinctiveness? Because obviously species are different, but yet they are connected to one another, because when you think about how did that species arise, so we'll tackle those questions next. Okay, we know that species only exchange genetic material with members of its own species. But if sympatric species commonly exchange genes, they don't, but let's just say that if they did, we might expect that that species would lose its distinctions because our gene pool would be more homogenized. So kind of like everyone's kind of more the same towards each other. The ability of isolated populations of single species to share genes, that's the gene flow that we talked about last chapter, may keep populations integrated as members of the same species.
So you're saying like those two different birds that look the exact same, if they went to the same feeder and then started mating between each other, then they would all be the same?
Yes.
Or similar?
Yes. They would kind of form a new species in a way. Very well. Yeah. Okay, so this brings us to something called the biological species concept. This is one way to define what a species is. And this is the actual definition in your book. So I'm just going to read it, but I'm going to break it down. Okay, the biological species concept defines a species as a population or a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed with one another in nature to produce viable, fertile offspring, but who cannot produce viable, fertile offspring with members of other species. So as long as it can mate with someone that can produce viable offspring, then they are the same species. You could think of it as a businesswoman in Manhattan has little probability of producing offspring with a dairyman in Mongolia, but if the two should get together, they could have viable babies that develop into fertile adults.
So a tiger and a lion making a liger would not be a species.
Yeah, we're going to get there. Yeah. Okay, so remember our meadowlarks? Here we have similar structures, but they are different species, that different mating calls. They do have, slightly different patterns, but they look very, very similar. Humans, we are all the same species, but there's diversity among us or between us. Isn't that just like mind-blowing what we're talking about right now? Like these guys look more similar to each other, but they're different species, and here we have the human race with lots
complex.
of, yeah.
Jeez, Zach. Tone it down there, bud.
Okay, so in simpler terms, a species is composed of populations whose members mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. If they cannot mate or cannot produce fertile offspring, then we call them reproductively isolated, and they are members of different species. But I do like to note that there are some flaws with the biological species concept. Some separate species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, but this is not under natural conditions. Like sometimes we do it in the zoo or a lab. But because that they still have that ability to interbreed and produce the fertile offspring, they are considered reproductively isolated because genes cannot enter the gene pool of other species.
So that would be like tiger and liger, or tiger and lion.
Yeah. So what causes the reproductive isolation between these species? So we have different mechanisms that we'll call the reproductive isolation mechanisms, which are barriers that prevent that genetic exchange between those two species. And you can kind of group them into two categories: pre-zygotic isolated mechanisms. So pre-zygotes, so before sperm and egg meet, there are barriers that the species would have to overcome. And then we also have post-zygotic isolated mechanisms, which means that the sperm and the egg have now combined, but there's still barriers after the zygote is produced. We are not looking at geographic barriers, so like different locations. We are looking at biological barriers, so we call these intrinsic. For example, a fly will not mate with a frog or a fern, but what prevents species that are very similar from interbreeding? So these mechanisms come into play here. So first we'll start with pre-zygotic, which means it prevents the formation of a zygote. And the first one we're going to talk about is the ecological isolation, which means we have two species. They are in the same area. They utilize different portions of the environments, and as a result, they do not hybridize because they don't really encounter each other. And so here's where the ligers come into play. In India, the territories for lions and tigers overlap thousands of kilometers. But due to ecological...
Teachers, please restrict movement for students outside the classroom. Okay, thank you.
Trying to boss us on a Monday?
Wow.
That's harsh.
But due to ecological and behavioral differences, they do not hybridize. Our lions, they're in the open grasslands. They hunt in prides. Tigers, solitary creatures of the forest. But you know that we know that they can hybridize because we've seen it in zoos with ligers.
Too bad.
Wait, that's a real thing.
Why? Yes,
Ligers
dude.
are real.
I didn't know that.
They
You
are.
think I've been talking about
I've never
parts
seen a
of it?
liger.
Well, you've been
Like,
saying
look
that.
it
pick down your
up.
picture.
You just say a lot of nonsense.
Look it up.
Okay.
We want to see ligers.
Some examples of this ecological isolation. Let's take a look at some species of frogs in America. The Bufo woodhousei and Bufo americanus. Their territories do overlap, but because they have kind of different behaviors. One of them breeds in the streams. One of them tend to breed in rainwater puddles. They can produce hybrids, but they don't because they have these different ecological isolations. We also have behavioral isolations. So maybe there's differences in courtship and hunting rituals. So here's a great example with mallards and pintail ducks. When mallard and pintail ducks are in captivity, they will mate and produce viable offspring with one another. But in the wild, they remain separate, even though their nests are side by side. There's lots of ways that sympatric species avoid mating with members of the wrong species. They look for visual cues. They have different sound production, which means calls, songs, vibrations, maybe insect wings. Sometimes they'll vibrate in a certain rhythm to woo the female. Chemical signals, that what we call pheromones. Like I noticed the girls in Herman Norcross sniffing Andrew. So maybe they were checking out his pheromones. Who knows?
Oh, God,
I
that's
smelled dog poop. I was not smelling him.
Yeah, actually, I didn't know that.
No.
Okay. A great example of pheromones, female moths. They will release pheromones into the air, and the males can follow it for miles. And it's kind of like a chemical trail that leads to the female. So different species use different chemical compounds.
Oh, that cartoon was there.
Oh, sorry.
It got me. That's a good one.
And then we also have electroreception. Sometimes, like eels, they might discharge an electrical receptor, again, to woo a mate. We have temporal isolation, so different breeding seasons that prevent hybridizations. So, for example, we have 5 species of frogs of the genus Ranus in the eastern United States, but they have different breeding seasons like fall, spring, summer. The western spotted skunk tends to breed in late summer, the eastern spotted skunk late winter, so because of these differences in breeding, they don't hybridize. And then finally we have mechanical isolation, which means that they are just anatomically, the parts don't fit together, okay?
Makes sense.
So maybe it's the size of the body, the structure of the male and female copulatory organs. In insects, male sex organs are very diverse. And then you can check out that comic on your own. Herman, can you even see? Do you have your notes up?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, another type of pre-zygotic prevention of the gamete fusion. Sometimes when gametes are shed in water, the eggs and sperm of different species are not attracted to one another, so they will not fuse with one another. If it's on land, The sperm may function very poorly within that reproductive tract, which means it never gets to the egg. In plants, plants have to, when the pollen reaches the female reproductive tract, it actually has to build a pollen tube to get down to the egg. So if the pollen tube just doesn't work or isn't built, then hybrids will not result. And then finally, the geographical isolation, where we have species in different areas, which means they're separate by a physical barrier. That's a lot of pre-zygotic barriers. This is a diagram that kind of illustrates some of them, but not all of them. But you can see habitat isolation, the temporal, different breeding seasons, different behaviors, and the mechanical isolation. So like, for example, in this diagram here, the blue-footed booby, which we will talk more about later on, the males actually dance, and they'll show off their blue feet. And then if the females think it's a great dance, then he's the one, basically. We'll talk about how snails reproduce. They basically stab each other with penises. Yeah. So here it looks like they have habitat isolation, so very similar species of snakes, but looks like one's in the water, one looks like it's in the desert. So I don't like snakes. We'll just move on. Yeah. Okay, so those were pre-zygotic. Now we're going to move on to post-zygotic. So sperm and egg have met, but there are still some mechanisms that will prevent normal developments. So like reduced hybrid viability. Sometimes development will abort the embryo. I think it's supposed to be if they don't, they are frail. Sorry, if they don't. Sometimes it doesn't abort, and then the species that results is just very frail or weak. Reduced hybrid fertility. Sometimes the offspring, they are either completely or largely sterile. So like donkeys. Mules, yeah. And then we have hybrid breakdown, which means that the first generation can reproduce, but then after that, it's pretty much sterile. So we call it hybrid breakdown.
You should breed cheetahs and dogs. Sweet, fast dogs.
So a diagram depicting this. Here I have fertilization, and there's some mechanisms after post-zygotes. So the embryos do not develop properly. Hybrid adults do not survive in nature. The adults are sterile or reduced fertility. But if it can accomplish all of that, you might end up with a fertile hybrid offspring. Okay. Like I said, there's some, I don't want to say loopholes, but the biological species concept doesn't really explain everything that we see. We know that species should not interbreed, but sometimes they do in nature. And so like the grizzly bear with the polar bear. That happens.
So sweet.
Yeah. Plants often undergo substantial amounts of hybridization. In one study, they were studying plants in California. They realized that 50% of the plant species, they couldn't isolate it according to its own genetic material, which meant that these plants, they were hybridizing all the time. Their genetic information wasn't distinct. So maybe it only applies, like it applies to plants, but does it apply to animals? Well, then we were looking at birds, and we noticed that 10% of bird species known do hybridize in nature. So finches, we'll talk about finches here.
Always comes back to those finches.
Yeah, those finches. So they have a new hypothesis to kind of help with this ecological species concept, which means that there are distinctions among species, and they are maintained by natural selection. The idea is that each species is adapted to its own specific part of the environment. And so our alleles are stabilized because those new alleles that enter the gene pool are quickly eliminated because they're not able to adapt to the environment, or they're not suited for the environment, so they get selected against. Okay. Some other weaknesses with the biological species concept. It's not possible to observe if organisms do or do not interbreed naturally. We know many species do coexist without interbreeding in nature, but they do in artificial settings. There's also no way to check interbreeding in the extinct forms. So by looking at fossils, I mean, when you look at fossils, you have no way to tell if it interbred with another species. And then finally, no utility at all for life forms that are entirely asexual. So it doesn't account for the asexual organisms.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this diagram right here, you can see that I have a species, and we call this line here stasis, so it remains a species. But then maybe something happens, okay? And then pretty soon we have branched off into different species. So how does one ancestral species like our finches, because they said that all 14 species came from one, have divided into, in this case, 2 descendant species, or more than 2, I should say. So we call this cladogenesis. We're going to be talking about cladograms in the next couple chapters
I get
here.
how like natural selection eliminates the weak basically, but if it still came from one species, they had to have moved apart from each other to like, because otherwise they would still all be the same.
Right, because the blending of alleles, yeah. So here's where your reproductive isolation comes into play, Max.
Only be partially.
Okay, so selection may reinforce isolating mechanisms. So basically what it says is that when we form a species, okay, so it's like a continuous process, meaning that the 2 populations of species may be partially reproductively isolated from one another. So because of maybe ecological or behavioral differences, they may be more likely to mate with members of their own population, but we do know that matings between populations do occur. So what happens when 2 populations that come in contact depends on which isolating mechanisms have evolved. If there's no mechanism, they will interbreed freely. The gene pool becomes homogenized, which means that they're all kind of the same. They lose their distinctiveness, and they kind of become this one new species that all of them are like. But if there is a mechanism, then that means that no genetic exchange will result, and we'll end up with 2 populations with 2 different species. So as we were discussing our finches, we knew that 14 different species of finches came from 1. So there must have been a lot of isolated mechanisms in order to evolve into those 14 different species. And so during this process of the speciation, there is a state called this intermediate state, where the organism is maybe partly sterile or maybe not well adapted. And so that's going to be a disadvantage for that species. But with time, it will improve pre-zygotic isolated mechanisms, and the 2 populations will be completely reproductively isolated. So this is called reinforcement when it's incomplete isolated. So during this intermediate state, reinforcement's taken place, and then once that isolating mechanism is put in place, then natural selection will kind of take over. So an example of reinforcement. The pied and the collared flycatchers, which are species of birds. We have 2 species. They are geographically separated, so we call them allopatric, not sympatric. Sympatric means they would be in the same location. So these are allopatric. They are similar in color. Sometimes in the Czech and Slovakia regions, the 2 species occur together, and they will hybridize, produce an offspring with low fertility. As a result, these species evolve to look very different and prefer to mate with individuals of their own species colorizations, which means that the hybrids only mate with the hybrids. So the population of these 2 species, they came in contact, natural selection led to the evolution of differences in color pattern, resulted in evolution of behavioral pre-zygotic isolation.
So like if a polar bear and a grizzly bear mated and their offspring, it would only be able to mate with another hybrid like that?
It might. I don't know. Because this, I don't know if they're looking at that. I know with the birds, like this is something that they looked at specifically. So I don't know if anyone's looking at polar bears and grizzly bears.
Well, they should, because that'd be sweet. Some roller bears running around.
Yep. So there's basically 3 kind of outcomes in this hybrid zone, if you want to call it a hybrid zone. It's either going to result in reinforcement, which means that a barrier will be set in place, and then they'll just kind of diverge into their own species until they can no longer breed with one another. fusion, which means that they will become one, and then stability, which means that the fit hybrids continue to be produced. So, kind of 3 outcomes. All right, the last section I think we'll cover today, the role of genetic drift in natural selection and speciation. So we know that random changes can occur and may cause reproductive isolation. So genetic drift, that's what GD stands for. In small populations, we've talked about the founder effect and population bottlenecks. But given enough time, these populations will become isolated and they will diverge. And as a result, it won't be a small populations, it will be a large population. So we have this transition from small to large. Case study, the Hawaiian Islands are amazing to study this. Lots of different species to look at, but in this case they looked at Drosophila, which is that fruit fly. And they were looking at courtship behavior. So colonization of new islands by flies involved a founder effect. So we have this big population of fruit flies, and some of them were selected and placed on an island. There were changes in courtship between ancestor and descendant populations, and that may have been the result of those founder events. So here you can see the many, many different types of fruit flies and how they have colonized the Hawaiian Islands. Adaptation can also lead to speciation or formation of new species. So a population of species adapt to different circumstances, they accumulate many differences, and it leads to that reproductive isolation. So the anolis lizards, the males have something called this dewlap, which hangs off their chin. And as adaptation has occurred, you know, they have different colors, and they use this dewlap to court females. But not only is it good for behavioral, you know, attracting females, it also has an advantage in the environment. So if your dewlap is light colored, it means that you'll most likely find this lizard reflecting light in a dim forest. If it's dark, it's going to be a bright glare in open habitats. So they're found in many different types of habitats, and they stay in those habitats, and as a result, you basically form new species. Okay. So that does it for today for part 1. The questions are at the end here. You can see they're multiple choice, and then there's 2 short answers underneath. So, questions? All right, the assignment is due tomorrow. You got plenty of work time to work on it.
Lights off, I say.
Lights off.
Yes.
Okay. I will post the video to the class website.